Hello, I'm doing a book review, and I'm joined by my friend Chris, who's been in a few of my videos before. But the book we're reviewing is I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. Now, this was published in 1954, and it seems like 1954 was definitely an interesting year for science fiction, like, not just science fiction literature, but also movies as well. You had the original Godzilla come out this year.
That's right.
You had the original novel Invasion of the Body Snatchers come out this year. You also had Lord of the Flies, if you want to count that as a science fiction novel.
Yeah, you could.
You also had Them come out this year, so this was definitely a big year for science fiction, I would say.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, it was all about just what was going on at the time. You know, nuclear warfare, paranoia in general, communism, that kind of thing. You see it throughout all these stories, but in this one in particular, it's just kind of wariness of where things are going.
Yeah.
Both with, like, society and just with, like, how it affects the individual.
Richard Matheson, this is probably his most famous work, I would say, but he was also a big part of the Twilight Zone. Like, some of the most famous Twilight Zone episodes were based on Richard Matheson's stories, like Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, Little Girl Lost, Death Ship, and he wrote a couple of others as well. Actually, I would almost argue that Matheson was just as integral to the Twilight Zone as Rod Serling was.
Ooh, that's very true, yeah.
Matheson also wrote books like The Shrinking Man, Hell House, What Dreams May Come, Bid Time Return, A Stir of Echoes, and many others. He also wrote an episode of the original Star Trek series called The Enemy Within. He also wrote many of the Roger Corman, Edgar Allan Poe adaptations. And Matheson was also a huge influence on people like Stephen King, Dean Koontz, Anne Rice. Even Steven Spielberg actually owes a lot to Richard Matheson because Spielberg's first movie, Duel, was based on a Richard Matheson story.
Yeah, that's such a great, sort of minimalist movie, yeah.
Yeah. Now, this book had a huge influence on the vampire genre, but also on the zombie genre as we know it now. George Romero outright admitted that Night of the Living Dead was basically a ripoff of this novel. And you could count Night of the Living Dead as sort of an unofficial adaptation of this novel, and you could definitely see the influence. At the same time, though, I also think Romero wasn't really giving himself the credit he deserved by saying this was an outright ripoff of I Am Legend, but still, you could see the similarities between the two works.
He added a lot to it. It reminds me of kind of the differences between Haunting of Hill House and Rose Red, the Stephen King miniseries. I guess same general principle, but done in very different ways, in ways that are very distinct to both writers.
Mm-hmm.
I really wouldn't call it an adaptation of I Am Legend. It's very much like Romero's first movie. That's his first, excursion into storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
I guess you could say Ben kind of resembles Neville in a lot of ways. He's very resourceful. He's very level-headed. He's a dude who can do a very good job of surviving in the apocalypse.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, there's not really much else. And I mean,
the whole idea of, barricading yourself in one location and stuff, the whole idea of the dead taking over the earth and stuff,
right.
You can see the influence there. So, what do you think of I Am Legend?
I like it a lot. It sets the mold for so much stuff, for global pandemics, apocalyptic novels, the way we look at vampires, the way we look at zombies, kind of isolationist stories. The characterization is I think the most interesting thing for me, because just the way that what Neville knows about his situation, the way he responds to it, why he's the last one. It's a lot of really cool, really intriguing things to kind of be able to fit into a 160-page book. What I really think is its biggest downfall, though, is I really think it would have worked a little better if it had been written in the first person.
Okay.
Because then you really would have gotten a great sense of his isolation. I think the fact that there's an omniscient narrator and who's dictating all this to you, that kind of takes away a little bit from the experience. The last monologue, I feel like that really would have... it works perfectly. It's one of my favorite parts of the book, but it feels like it would have been a bit more... It would have had more resonance if it was from his perspective rather than just like a storyteller telling us his perspective. You would have got a much bigger sense of how lonely he was and how bored he was, and all this different stuff. I feel like it would have came off better if it had come from his own words.
Yeah, but being what happens to Neville at the end, or definitely the implication of what happens to Neville at the end, it probably wouldn't have made much sense if it was like a first-person narrative, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I get what you mean.
But I Am Legend, for me, this might actually be my favorite novel of all time.
Wow.
Like, it's sort of a tie between this and Stephen King's It, for what one is like my favorite book of all time, but this was actually a really important part of my love of horror literature, because I first found out about the book when I was watching an interview with George Romero when he said that he basically ripped Night of the Living Dead off from I Am Legend. That's how I first found out about the book. Then I was watching this movie called The Last Man on Earth with Vincent Price, and I saw in the opening credits from the novel I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. I'm like, holy shit, it's that novel! And then and so I fell in love with that movie. A few months later, I saw the Omega Man, and then right around the time when the Will Smith I Am Legend movie was coming out, I thought, why don't I try to read the book? And I first read this in high school because I was 15 when the Will Smith movie came out, and this just, I don't know, I just absolutely fell in love with it when I first read this, and I was actually kind of obsessed with this book in high school, and I've actually read this 6 times already. This is actually my 6th time reading it.
Wow.
Yeah, so this is a book I really do adore. And I'm not going to say it's a flawless novel by any means. Later on we'll get into some of the problems that the book might have, but still, it's a book that's very near and dear to me.
That's good. Yeah, I mean, I don't think I've even read my own favorite novel 6 times, so the fact that it's that important to you means a lot. I've really been gearing up to do this review.
Now, what the plot of I Am Legend is, it's set in the future. It's actually set in the 1970s, because this was published in the 50s, and obviously back then, the 70s was the future, but it's set after a biological plague pretty much destroys human civilization, and the story follows a man named Robert Neville, who is apparently the last living human on Earth, but it turns out many of the plague's victims have come back from the dead as vampires, and the book is set over the course of 3 years, and it follows Neville pretty much by day he goes out and he hunts the vampires, but at night he barricades himself in his home and the vampires come and try to get in. And that's the basic plot line, and it sounds very simple, but it really is a character study first and foremost. Beyond being a horror and science fiction novel, this is really a character drama. It's very much a psychological character study on really what would it be like if you were the last human being on Earth, or at least thought you were the last human being on Earth. What would that do to a person psychologically? And it's really a study on loss and isolation, I would say.
Yeah, it's very scary when you break down the psychology of it, because just imagine being in that place where you're the only living thing it's completely in sight. It's incredible. You see it, a really good version of it that I think might not have been intentional was from 28 Days Later.
Oh yeah, we're going to talk about that later on when we talk about the influence that this novel had on other things.
That's right. It's really scary, and it's really a freaky thing to think about, the idea that you're the remnant of civilization, or at least the civilization that that you come from, you're used to.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very frightening idea, and it works so well.
Mm-hmm. We are going to get into some spoilers. I think it's unavoidable when I'm doing a review with another person. If we're going to get into a discussion, it's kind of unavoidable to get into spoilers. But, spoiler alert, towards the end of the novel, Neville does meet a woman named Ruth, who seems to be a normal human woman, but eventually you find out she's actually basically a vampire. It turns out that there's another group of vampires that are more evolved, I would say, or more they still have human intelligence, they still act like humans, and it turns out that this group of vampires is sort of trying to rebuild civilization again, and the whole point of the novel, the reason it's called I Am Legend, is because Neville is the last human being on Earth, and the whole idea is that vampires are becoming the new reality, and humans are becoming the legend. Humans are becoming the myth.
It's great that it turns the whole thing on its head, is what I like. In that last scene, you realize, okay, so to some degree, this is the story of the monster.
Yeah.
Not in the way we were expecting, though. We've been following the monster the entire time. He's not the survivor. He's the freak left in the darkness. He is to vampires what vampires were to us. Mm-hmm. And that's a very cool, very interesting way to flip it. He kind of, that whole last monologue is so great. I think it's so greatly worded. I think it's I am the terror.
Yeah, something like that.
Forever. Mm-hmm. It's such a cool way to articulate that. Mm-hmm. I love that ending.
Now, the ending of the book, it's a very grim and nihilistic ending. At the same time, though, there is a strange sense of hope, but it's not hope for us. It's hope for the vampires, pretty much. Like, the vampires they're the new reality. They're the new civilization, and Neville, he really represents the old world and how the old world is dying. So it's a nihilistic ending, but it's also sort of a happy ending, depending on whose side you're on, depending on which perspective you look at.
Right, yeah. I mean, it's also like, it's society in general.
Yeah.
And I like the idea that it's not necessarily a happy ending because at least some sort of civilization is going to keep going. Mm-hmm. So I guess it's hopeful in that way. But the thing that I find so intriguing is that in that ending, he can't even blame them for how they look at him. Because, I mean, they look at him the way that he looks at vampires, and he just spent, a good few years just in like this terrifying, almost like prison, just trying to stay alive. And he gets it, so it's a strangely like peaceful, almost like copacetic death, despite the fact that he's being executed and that he's seen as like this like terrible, like frightening thing that's left over from a world that's just like totally over.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of conflicting emotions, and it's a weird way to look at it. But it works very well.
Obviously, the novel's main theme is isolation.
Of course.
And, like, what isolation does to people. Loneliness is a scary thing, like, especially, like, being alone for so long. And there is a point in the story where Neville gets used to his isolation, but it also describes him as being sort of, when he gets used to it, he kind of just dies inside. Mm-hmm. And that's maybe the irony there, because you have these dead people coming back to life trying to eat him, and yet he's kind of the one who's dead, in a way.
Yeah, for sure.
There is definitely the theme of, like, nuclear warfare in the novel, because even though it was a plague that wiped out humanity, while they never tell you where this plague came from, it's very much implied that this plague has sort of always existed. Like, this is where the old legends of vampires came from in this universe. But in the novel, you find out that there was a Third World War, or at least it's implied that there was a Third World War, and it's also very much implied that bombs were dropped, and you kind of get the idea that maybe whatever fallout from this limited nuclear exchange that might have happened probably mutated this germ in some way, and that's why it spread and basically wiped out humanity. So I feel like there is sort of this subtle theme of nuclear warfare.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, for the time it was written, I mean, that was the big threat that was looming. Scientists were working on it. There was all these rumors that it was inevitably like going to wipe out the world if it got too advanced, and you see it, you brought up Godzilla earlier, that came out of like the threat of like nuclear warfare, nuclear radiation. What could this stuff do to the world? Are we fucked? That kind of thing. So This is just like a huge extrapolation of that, to the point where like there's only one dude left on the planet, and he's about as fucked as you can be. So
yeah, and it also makes you wonder, what would you do if you were the last human being on Earth? Like, would you kill yourself? Because it's like, really, if you're the last person on Earth, what's the point anymore? You're not going to be remembered after you die. Nothing humanity did up until that point is going to be remembered after that. Like, that's one of the most frightening things about the book, and one of the most sad things about the book, too. It's a very sad story.
That theme of loneliness really is something that affects me, because I really like people, believe it or not. I like being around other people and interacting, and it's a really scary idea to think that just there's nobody left. So it definitely affects me on like a personal level, because I could not stand being the last person on the planet. But the really scary idea is that saying you're the last person on the planet, there's a whole like sinister subtext to that.
Yeah.
Like the idea of like you're not alone despite the fact you're the last person on the planet. There's like all this like crazy shit that's coming. These vampires, or these dead alive vampires. Mm-hmm. So it's you're kind of that singled out weak thing that they got to take down, even though they are frightened of you. So it works on two levels. That you're the monster that's left over, but also at the same time, like, you're the one remnant of humanity, and these things are both scared and gunning for you. It's frightening as hell.
Now, one really sad scene in the book. Now, in the book, you find out that before civilization fell, basically martial law was declared because of this plague, and if your loved one died of the plague, they had to be taken away by the military and burned. And Neville, his wife dies, and he refuses to let his wife be burned in this pit, so he takes his wife and he's going to secretly bury her, and his neighbor sees this and comes up to him and he's like, "Can you take my mother too?" And he thinks he's going to the pit, and there's just something very sad about that scene. Like,
yeah. It's such a frightening idea to think that, okay, just for the sake of humanity, like, you're gonna have to cut these ties, and you're gonna have to disregard your own humanity just for the greater good. There's a really dark irony to that to keep humanity going, you have to let the human part of yourself go, or at least the part of yourself that would feel some kind of regret about doing this, or some kind of hesitation. You have to be like, no, you gotta keep it going. And the whole, like, the memory of Virgin Karen is really that's really what cements him as lonely, because he can't help but think back on the people who were important to him and the people he lost. Mm-hmm. And now he's just like this walking pile of I don't think resentment is the right word, regret, basically, even though this wasn't necessarily something he could control. But at the same time, I mean, I guess maybe there was a different way of going about doing things, and he wants to kind of ruminate on that because he feels he owes it to his wife and kid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you had the whole subplot of the dog, which I think is something that everybody remembers from the book. There's a certain point in the book where he sees a dog, and even though it's not a person, it's like his one hope of having any sort of connection with anything. And it's a really sad part of the book. Even though we gave away some spoilers, I don't want to give too much away about what happens there, though.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for me as a dog lover, it affects me too. So it knows how to pull at your heartstrings. Richard was really good with that.
Yeah.
But just the idea that this thing it can't necessarily talk to you. It can interact with you in a way that is tangible, though. Is a way that can affect you. Most people who have pets, that's why they have pets. And the idea that, okay, you've been totally isolated from anything that resembles normal interaction for so long, and then this dog shows up and it just makes you go apeshit, basically, and you're just like, no, come, stay. Yeah. That desperation was something that really got to me. That scene, when he chases after the dog, when he chases after Ruth later. Mm-hmm. That really upfront, almost feral desperation to want to interact with something. Yeah. It really puts you in his head and really makes you question whether or not you would be in that same headspace, and if you had been in his place. Sorry. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned before how Neville almost becomes the monster in some sense, and you can really see that, especially, like, towards the end of the book when he meets Ruth, because there's a certain moment where, like, it talks about how at that point his sex drive has pretty much been used up, it's pretty much diminished because hasn't had sex for 3 years now, and he's kind of given up on it. But there's a certain moment where he kind of says to himself in his head that there was a certain point where, had he met Ruth earlier, he might have violated her.
Yeah,
so it's like, the fact that this guy would have probably raped her if he met her at a different time, like, that really does make you kind of lose a lot of sympathy for him. Mm-hmm. Even though he is, in general, a sympathetic character. Yeah, like, it shows you how his loneliness is really kind of destroying his humanity.
Exactly, yeah. Well, what I will say is that at least at this point, he's cognizant enough to know that that is a very wrong thing.
Yeah.
To know that, like, you know, a period ago, he would have done that. At least he has an idea that he's like, yeah, I would have been like an animal. It would have been terrible. And honestly, initially it put me off when I read, like, you know, the way he looks at Ruth, because there's so many passages that, like, talks about, like, him staring at her chest or legs and all this stuff. And initially, yeah, I was like, this is starting to get really fucking creepy, but it did occur to me that, you know, after, like, 3 months of not having any kind of...
Oh, no, 3 years.
Sorry, 3 years, you're right. Not having any kind of interaction, you know, of that kind, you know, like no sexuality, you know, like it would really affect you in a way that would make you not only irritable but also kind of like jumpy, and, you know, immediately your eyes would go to certain places and all that stuff. So I guess, yeah, it is you can be honest about it in that way, but at the same time there's something disturbing about it that, you know, Richard does a really good job of making sure that she is her own character, because when she kind of like calms down and she's like slept and stuff, there's a bit where she's like, you know, you realize you've kidnapped me, right?
Yeah.
And I'm in this frightening situation with a dude who looks like a psychotic fucking feral man, and you chased after me for, like, you know, for like a mile, right?
I don't know if it was a mile, but it was definitely a long distance. I chased after her, and he hit her because of how she was screaming at him and stuff.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, so there are points where Neville is definitely unlikable, but it's like, to a certain extent, you understand some of it, though.
Right.
Like, he wouldn't have been like this if none of this happened. Like, this is sort of... He's been driven crazy by his isolation, and the fact that you have these creatures trying to kill him and stuff.
Yeah. So it is realistic in that way that you're portraying, okay, how would that affect the way that you look at people, you know, sexually, emotionally, psychologically. So Ruth coming in kind of like throws a wrench into the whole thing, and it really makes you rethink your situation, because up until this point it's just been about isolation. Now it's about how do you interact with people, particularly when this really fucked up, unfortunate situation has left you socially awkward. Both in ways of like how you interact with women, how you interact with people in general. You know, he's sort of almost like a new person now. And looking at that, it's interesting to think about how in the ending he turns out to be the monster. So has he turned into a monster? Is it like the nature versus nurture debate? You know, has it been the situation that turned him into this? Is it the fact that there's a new society that has new standards that turned him into this? Or is it really just, is it all him? Is it the way he responded to his situation? There's a lot of really great debate there that kind of sticks with you long after you read the book. And it's, once again, it's so surprising that it comes out of like a quick 160-page story.
Now, Richard Matheson actually got the idea for this novel from Universal's 1931 adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, believe it or not. When he saw that movie, he thought, one vampire's scary, what if a whole world was filled with vampires?
That's a really good point. And something that didn't occur to me until just now is, you know, if you really look at this in the grand scheme of vampire literature in general, this is very revisionist.
Oh, yeah.
Because it reinterprets them as, okay, how scientifically and biologically do these things operate? You know, let's not look at it from like a gothic point of view or like, you know, even like a mythological point of view. Let's look at it as like, okay, they're a species and they're here and like they have, you know, here's how they work biologically and here's how we fight back. Here's how they operate, that kind of thing. Here's why garlic repels them. Here's why bullets can't stop them.
Yeah. And then it even gives, like, psychological reasons for why they're afraid of crosses.
That's right.
Like, because normally in vampire literature, vampires are supposed to be, like, spawns of Satan, so it makes sense why a cross would repel them, because you're supposed to assume that's God working through the cross, repelling the vampire, but these really aren't supernatural vampires. Like, as you pointed out, Matheson gives, like, these scientific explanations for the vampire, and So, like, when it comes to crosses and mirrors, he gives psychological explanations for why they're afraid of these things, and in a lot of cases, it sort of depends on what that person believed in their human lifetime. So, if a person was Jewish before they became a vampire, a cross wouldn't do shit to them. If a person was an atheist, a cross wouldn't do shit. So, it's really interesting how he really does sort of turn the vampire genre on its ear in a lot of ways. And for the time, because this was 1954, for the time, this really was a very original vampire story.
Yeah.
You didn't really see a lot of vampire stories that really sort of defied the expectations of the genre.
For sure. I mean, you brought up earlier Night of the Living Dead. I mean, this is the first time it's a virus. It's a plague. It's
Yes.
like it's something that's like, you know, going to wipe out everybody. You know, it was a very scary way of looking at it because it grounded it in reality to the point where you could believe that this was true. And as much as a lot of it is pseudoscience.
Oh, yes. That's actually, when I talked about how there are some flaws in the novel, I would say that is one of the big flaws, is the science. While I definitely appreciate that Matheson's trying to give a scientific explanation for how vampires could exist, it is very wonky when you stop to think about it.
I like to call it fantastical logic. That's the term I always use for it. You see it on Doctor Who. You see it on a lot of fantasy stuff, sci-fi, that kind of thing. It's like creaky logic where it's not totally like solid or anything like that. It's not Jules Verne, but it works and it does give you it grounds it somewhat and it gives you like a basis to go, okay, I could see this happening, or just like, you know, gives you a decent like plot reason for this to happen. So as much as it's a bit of a hole in it, you can tell Richard was trying to really like give this a scientific backdrop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, as much as I do love this book, I'm not going to pretend it's like a flawless novel by any means. I mean, my biggest issue is really just the science in it, how the science is a little wonky, and the book gets into a lot of detail about the science, but I mean, granted, I don't know shit about science, so I don't know how scientifically accurate and scientifically inaccurate it is, but it seems like a lot of it... It's funny, a lot of it does seem to be coming from actual scientific facts at the time, and then a lot of it is clear Matheson sort of just made this up off the top of his head.
Yeah, I mean, I think the explanation for why they can deflect gunfire, that one actually...
The body glue thing, I was like, okay, he pulled that out of his ass.
It's a leap in logic, but it does, I guess, if you're not really familiar with science, or if you have like a passing resemblance of it, it sort of makes sense to you.
And another thing I appreciated, though, is even though I know nothing about science, this is one of the few things I actually remembered from my science classes in high school. The book actually does point out the differences between bacteria and virus.
That's right.
And explains that this was a bacterial plague, not a viral plague.
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting.
That attention to detail, yeah. I keep thinking Jules Verne, because you see that all the time. Like, he wanted his science to be grounded in reality, even if it took up like 5 pages of exposition.
Yeah.
There are occasional moments like that in this, so if you're wary of those like long-winded explanations, it can drag a bit for you. So I guess you'd call that a flaw, depending on how you feel about that kind of thing. But I mean, it's just great that he at the very least tried to make sure that there was at least some thinking behind all this.
Could you think of any other flaws that the book might have?
I guess something that I'm really picky about is dialogue. But again, this was written in the 50s when people talked in a very different way.
Yeah.
Much more formally, that kind of thing. So maybe by today's standards, the dialogue is kind of wonky, but by then they were like, yeah, this is how people talk.
I didn't really mind the dialogue. There were moments where the prose were sort of like, okay, Matheson sort of used the same word in one sentence, where it's like, okay, you could have reworded that a little bit, but that's nothing really. You could tell he was young when he wrote this. Yeah. I think he was like maybe in his 20s or 30s when he wrote this book. But I will say, though, one strength of the book is, while it was written in the 50s, besides certain aspects where you could tell, okay, this was the 50s, there's a lot of the novel where this almost could have been written today.
Oh, I could see that. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I love the simple fact that it's set 20 years in the future kind of makes it sort of timeless. Because it's set 20 years in the future. Well, it makes it timeless,
but still, it's the 70s, which is now the past. Exactly. So I wouldn't say it's exactly timeless, but
I'm
I
just
get what you're
intrigued.
saying, though.
Yeah, I'm just like intrigued by the fact that like written in the 50s, took place 20 years in the future, and now we're far past that future that he envisioned. So yeah, I think there's sort of like a paradox kind of thing going on where it's timeless just from the fact that almost like it takes place in a deleted timeline, that sort of thing. If you look at it that way, yeah. So it gives it a cool sort of like out of the box quality.
Now, when I Am Legend was first published, it was published as a standalone novel, but most modern-day reprintings of the book come with bonus short stories at the end of it. Like, my copy of I Am Legend, basically the first half of this is the actual novel, and the rest are a bunch of bonus stories by Matheson. Now, some of the bonus stories in here are the short story Prey, which was adapted into one of the segments of Trilogy of Terror. You've seen that, right?
I've seen it.
And then, there's also a short story in here called The Near Departed, which I actually want to do a short film based on this short story because it's a really simple story. Like, it's only 3 pages, but the twist at the end of it is freaking brilliant. Now I want to cut to 2 short reviews that 2 friends of mine did on this book. The first short review was done by my friend Mark Allen Gunnels, and the other short review was done by my friend Christian Feliciano. So check out those reviews, and when we come back, we're going to be discussing the 3 film adaptations of this book, as well as the influence that this book had on pop culture.
Hello. My friend Christian asked me if I would do a short review for the novel I Am Legend by Richard Matheson, and I told him I would be happy to. I Am Legend is actually one of my absolute favorite vampire novels that I have ever read. I think Richard Matheson did something really special and groundbreaking, and something that continues to be an influence on the horror genre. This has been very influential, as I said, but not just on vampire fiction. I feel like the original Night of the Living Dead, that film took a lot of inspiration from I Am Legend. There was something about the whole feel and atmosphere of it that reminded me of this novel. And I think a lot of the success of this novel hinges on almost the mundane nature of it, and I don't mean that in a negative way at all. The existence of Robert Neville is presented in a very matter-of-fact way that makes his life seem almost routine, almost, as I said, mundane, just his day-to-day existence. And this actually helps ground it and make suspension of disbelief a whole lot easier. Because it is a fantastical novel set in a world very unlike our own, but he grounds it in such a way that it's easy to go with it. I particularly love the ending of this novel, the sort of twist that makes the title of the novel make a lot of sense. I think the ending elevates it even more into something that I think is a classic that is really going to stand the test of time. This has actually been made into a film 3 times. Originally a Vincent Price film called The Last Man on Earth, which honestly doesn't have a great reputation. I think even Matheson was not a fan of it, but I actually really like it. I think it's a faithful adaptation that really gets that atmosphere of the novel right. And again, when you watch Last Man on Earth and then you watch Romero's Night of the Living Dead, I think you'll be able to see the similarities and the influence there. It was also made into sort of a cheesy film with Charlton Heston, called The Omega Man. I've only seen bits of that. It seemed a little over the top and comical to me, and not really following the novel. And then it was made into a Will Smith movie, the only time they actually used the novel's title, I Am Legend, and I was not a fan of that one. It was just a ridiculous CGI action movie that bore very little similarity to the novel. And it was the one chance they had to really use that title and then have the ending that gives that twist on the title, and then they chose not to use that and went in a different direction. But the novel itself, I think, is brilliant. I love Richard Matheson, and this is probably the book he's most known for. And while I don't know if I would say it was my favorite because he has written so much great stuff, I definitely think it's one of his best, and I highly recommend it.
I'm ashamed to say that when I was a kid, I had never read Richard Matheson. For some reason, I just wasn't interested in any of his work. I knew he existed. I had heard about him in passing. And I had watched Duel, which is one of my favorite movies, and I knew that it was based on a Richard Matheson story. And of course I knew that Stephen King and a few other authors were also influenced by him. But for some reason, I just never got this urge to read any of his stuff. And then one day, I don't know how, I don't know why, but I Am Legend just appeared in my bookshelf. I'm told that I went and bought it, but I don't know why I would have done that. But anyway, I picked it up, read it, and hey, it turns out to be one of my favorite books of all time. And it is one of the greatest stories ever. Richard Matheson is just a great storyteller. After reading I Am Legend, I went and I read so many of his other works, and I love all of them. And I think I love him most because not only are his stories unique, but his prose style is great. And you can definitely tell where other authors, especially Stephen King, were inspired by that. And now, in I Am Legend itself, this is no exception. The writing is fantastic. He can just tell a story, and it just goes by so great. The pacing is fantastic. The book is short. It's 120 pages, but you might think it's not going to go smooth because when you find out that it's really only about one character, you might say, oh, that might get boring. And I thought that too, but when you actually read it, you realize, no, this is paced fantastically. It's tight. It's really tight. Every page counts. Every sentence counts. He really knew how to keep you engaged. And to me, that's just amazing, especially when you're dealing with just one character. I mean, there's no dialogue in it, except from the vampires who are trying to seduce Neville to come outside. No spoiler alerts, wink, wink. So that's all I'll say about the dialogue. But, yeah, it's just great. There's a point in the story where he meets a dog, and if you had seen the movie, you would think that the book, the dog was in the entire book. No, the dog is only in a little part of it, and that is very emotional. That's a very emotional thing that happens. And Richard Matheson really pulls at your heartstrings with that. I loved it. It's creepy at times. The vampires are creepy, especially when they're trying to seduce Neville to come outside. And they do weird things. I never expected a book from this time period, and I should have, but anyway, I didn't, to go into sexual themes. It does. Now, it's not pornographic in any way. There's no crazy nudity or anything like that. So it's clean enough for, even the most conservative person to read it. But it does go into that stuff. And I love how it goes into the folklore of the vampire. I like how he questions whether a vampire who is Jewish would be affected by a crucifix. That's fantastic. The science in it is also pretty cool. It's a fantastic story. Like I said, it's 120 pages. It's short, but you will not regret reading this book, and you can read it over and over and over again and still love it. I do. I love this book to death. It's just fantastic. I love this book. I recommend everybody read it. It's one of the greatest horror stories of all time. It's one of the greatest science fiction stories of all time, fantasy, whatever you want to consider it. And yeah, definitely check out I Am Legend, and thank you.
Now, this book was adapted into a 1964 film called The Last Man on Earth with Vincent Price. In the movie, Vincent Price played what was basically the Robert Neville role, only in the movie they called him Robert Morgan for some reason. The Last Man on Earth, that's always been one of my favorite horror films, and it still is. I still love that movie, but I rewatched it again the other night, and while I still love the film, it didn't hold up quite as well for me as it used to, but it's still a movie that's very near and dear to me because it's basically the movie that... It was because of that movie that I read the book, because I saw that first, and later on I decided to check out the book, but it's still a good movie, but it's definitely a very flawed movie. There are a lot of aspects of that film that are really cheesy, but I still like it. But what do you think of The Last Man on Earth?
I like it a lot. I think what helps it is that it is it's very faithful. Despite the fact like they changed his name, but I mean, if you watch it, if you read the book, then immediately kind of watch the movie. There's like scenes that are in there verbatim to some degree.
Yes.
What I will say is I feel like the flashbacks in this, as opposed to the book, it kind of derails things a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't know why. It's just it feels like they spend more time on it than they do in the book. It sort of throws off sort of the whole isolation bit. But something that helps with this adaptation, and helps with all three adaptations of it, is you have a really, really good actor playing Robert, and that kind of...
Yeah, Vincent Price, which he always brings his A-game to everything. But an issue I had with the movie also was there was a lot of, like, exposition dialogue in it, and some of the dialogue I thought was really cheesy, and honestly, I could have done without his narration in the film.
See, I thought that worked, because I was talking earlier about how, like, I feel like the novel would have worked better in first person. Hearing him kind of dictate it to you, that gives you a better sense of his isolation, and the fact that he's the last person on Earth. You know, I think it works a little better.
Okay.
Can't bear to see their image. It repels them. I need more mirrors. And this garlic's lost its pungency. There was a time when eating was pleasurable. Now it bores me. Just fuel for survival. I'll settle for coffee and orange juice this morning.
Yeah, but once again, despite its flaws, I still really like The Last Man on Earth. Now, the film is in the public domain, so you could watch it on YouTube, and it's available on, like, almost any of those, like, public domain box sets.
That's where
which I have. Yeah, I have a couple of those box sets, and I have it on a couple of them. But yeah, it's a good movie. And it is true to the book. It does change a few things, but of all the adaptations, it's probably the one that's the most true to the book.
Easily, yeah, without question. What I will say, though, the ending changes things up a little bit.
I feel like the ending of The Last Man on Earth, in some ways, kind of misses the point of the ending of the book in a lot of regards. It's not as nihilistic, because it sort of implies that there's a cure, which... there was no real cure in the book at all, so... Yeah, I feel like the ending of the movie kind of misses the point. Once again, like, it's a movie I do love, but it just didn't hold up for me as well watching it again the other night.
Well, for me, it's an interesting change in characterization between the adaptations, particularly, like, right before the ending, where... in the book, he was ambivalent about the fact that he was the last man on Earth. He understood everybody's perspective on it. He got that this is just what he is now. Whereas in the movie, it seems, I think his last lines is literally like, "You're all freaks. I'm the only real one left."
Yeah.
You know, he has a very bitter opinion on it in the final moments, and it's a very different turn, and I was intrigued by it.
You freaks. All of you freaks. Mutations.
I know that Richard wrote at least the first draft of this.
Yeah, it was written by Richard Matheson, but when the movie came out, he used a screen name or a pen name, Logan Swanson, which is a pen name he used a lot.
Yeah, because he wasn't happy with the final product. So I'm guessing that one of the subsequent drafts is where like they changed the name and all the different stuff. It could be better directed. I'll give it that.
It definitely has the feel of like a Corman film. Exactly. I don't think Corman had anything to do with it. I know it was an AIP production, and I know Corman had something to do with them. But yeah, it's very much a B movie. Although I will say, to the movie's credit, there are some shots in the movie, like in the beginning, of like these apocalyptic, like empty cities. I thought were really well done.
Yeah.
So I'll give the movie credit in that regard.
It's a little confused about what it wants to be, because you see it. I think it's sort of between whatever Richard wrote and whatever the revised stuff was that made it a little bit more of that B movie feel. Because you see them trying to go for like, okay, here's the dark isolation, here's that loneliness, but at the same time, that whole like opening title sequence with the overly dramatic music and the intertitles, it kind of just like slaps a B movie flavor on it.
another day to live through. Better get started.
Yeah, it's funny, like, the book, it was a horror and science fiction novel, but before any of that, it was also a psychological character drama. The movie tries to be a character drama, but ultimately it just ends up being more of a B-movie.
Right.
However, there is one scene in the movie that I think works very well. It's a scene where Robert's watching a home movie of his family, and when he's watching that, he starts laughing, and then he starts breaking down, crying, and it's like, yeah, that's where I totally see this coming from the book. Even though that wasn't in the book, still, that was a very emotional scene, and was actually very good acting from Vincent Price.
That was a welcome addition, yeah. Really great performance from him in that scene. You kind of, he nails, like, the maniacalness of it, and then on top of that, like, the sadness of it, that he's just, like, you know, he's left with nothing after having what was kind of an idyllic life. Yeah.
I want to point out that before The Last Man on Earth, Richard Matheson actually sold the rights to Hammer, and Hammer was going to do an adaptation of I Am Legend, but apparently the British censors thought the novel was too intense or something, or thought it would be too, like, disturbing for British audiences at the time. But how awesome would that have been, a Hammer adaptation of I Am Legend?
They would have nailed it, yeah. And I think, maybe I'm wrong on this, I think at one point Fritz Lang was supposed to direct.
Was he even still alive at that point?
I think so. He was going into, like, his waning years, but I think if it had been him, he really would have done an awesome version of this. I think Richard was really excited to hear that, and when he heard that they wound up changing it up, he was like, well, it's no, you know. But that would have been amazing, you know.
Oh yeah,
he really would have gotten that tone down.
Now there was another film adaptation in 1971 called The Omega Man, which had Charlton Heston as Robert Neville, and that movie changes everything from the book. First of all, they're not vampires in that movie. They're actually sort of this religious cult that think Robert Neville is the devil because they have banned all machinery and they see that Neville still uses machinery, and they sort of blame Neville for what happened to the world. And in the movie, they are infected, and basically the virus or bacteria or whatever it is in that movie sort of makes them albinos, so they can't come out during the day. But that's really the only similarities. They're not vampires at all in that movie. Once again, they're this religious cult who call themselves the Family, and being that that movie came out in 1971, which was right around the time you had the Manson family, maybe that was trying to reflect on that in some way.
Could be.
But I love the Omega Man. Like, it is more of an action movie, and it's a lot more cheesy than, like, the book was. And even though Last Man on Earth was a little cheesy, Omega Man's even more cheesy. But I will give the movie some credit. I think Charlton Heston does a great job in the movie, and Charlton Heston does capture the whole psychological aspect of it, where you have him, in the movie, he starts talking to, like, his friend is a little bust of Julius Caesar,
Yes.
and, like, at one point, he hears these phones ringing, and he just screams, "There is no phone ringing, damn it!" Charlton Heston, he does capture a lot of the psychological aspects of Robert Neville very well in that movie. But the movie does kind of miss the point of the book entirely when you find out there are other normal humans out there.
Yeah.
Like, it does explain that they're still infected in some way, but still, they're still normal people, so it misses the point of the book, but I still really do like the Omega Man. But what do you think of the Omega Man?
I really like it too. I will say that Charlton, out of the three of them, again, another guy can hold the whole movie by himself. I've always been a big fan. He's the one that really looks the most like the way Richard described him. Like
Oh, yes,
pale
yes.
blue eyes, blonde hair.
He was actually very good casting for Neville.
Exactly. Yeah. But yeah, like you said, it goes in a completely different direction. It's not really. What I will say is the abrupt opening I love. I love that, like, smash cut to this just, like, wide cityscape where there's nobody except him. Like, that really nailed the isolation right out of the gate. But very quickly you start to realize they're focusing on other things here, because he's not as alone as Robert is in the book. There's plenty of humans who survived. They become a big part of the plot. They're a huge part of the movie.
Mm-hmm. There was a really good line in the movie, though, where one of the other normal humans that he meets, they're talking about restarting civilization again, and he says, "It will be like we're starting all over again, like in the Garden of Eden. Only this time we won't trust no freaking snake."
Yes.
And I thought, that was actually a really good line, and they were trying to touch on some interesting themes there, I think, about the mistakes that society has made and how we can right the wrongs of society.
Yeah. This focuses on that way more than it did on, like, the whole isolation aspect.
Yeah.
What I do like is, well, not even necessarily like, it's just you kind of see it have the same problems as Last Man on Earth, because it gets lost in its own style. Like, this is a very 70s movie. Like, it's a 70s character study.
Yeah.
And at times
it's funny
that
because
70s
Last Man on
cheese-
Earth was very 60s and this was very 70s.
Exactly. Yeah. That 70s cheese really sneaks in a lot. There's like this,
Which I don't mind that because I love the 70s. So
I like it too. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just it's sort of a conflict of tones at the same time. Yeah.
It was also a significant movie because there's actually an interracial relationship
That's right.
between him and I forgot the character's name,
Lisa.
but Lisa, who was basically the Ruth stand-in, who, she's a black woman, and you see this interracial relationship in a film that came out not too long after, like, Martin Luther King was assassinated, so...
Yeah, I think the first, like, interracial kiss that was in wide media was the Trek kiss between Kirk and Uhura.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's interesting that this is another, like, okay, here's what's going on in society now. You see it differently, like, each time the story is portrayed.
Mm-hmm. I also loved how, in the beginning of the film, he's just watching the Woodstock movie.
Yeah, that's hilarious. It's you can tell that, like, they were trying to do something different and something that was conscious of the time period, but at the same time very different from what the book was.
Oh yeah, and there's definitely a lot of commentary on, like, the counterculture movement in that movie and stuff.
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, that 70s cheese does sneak in, though, because, like, I mean, the fact that all the albinos are wearing cloaks for some fucking reason.
Yeah, well, they're kind of a religious cult, so I get that. I did like Matthias. I thought Matthias was a really good villain.
He was, yeah, and he was pretty much a from scratch villain too, because there's no real analog to him in the book.
Well, I mean, you could say he's sort of the stand-in for Ben Cortman.
To some degree,
yeah,
because he's the one that's, like, outside mocking him and shit like that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I can see that. But I mean, the ending completely just, like, switches it up from what the ending of the book was. Whereas the book, he was the last remnant of society. He was, like, this sort of, like, lonely monster. Whereas
in the movie they kind of make him almost like this Christ-like Messiah at the end.
Exactly. Yeah.
He's the savior of humanity.
Yeah, it's like the total opposite. But it's strangely, it's intriguing. It's cool to see them go in a totally different direction. It probably pissed a lot of people off who were fans of the book. Mm-hmm. But it ends on that cool image of like, you know, like the same position is Christ, that kind of thing, you know. So it's, if you can forgive it for how different it is, it's definitely, it is a good movie. And they were smart enough to change the title. Because like calling him the Omega Man, that implies that, okay, he's the last, but not in the way you would expect.
Yeah.
He's more of, he is like a Christ-like figure. He is, you know, the last one to have figured out how to beat all this, not the last one ever. It's more of like an elated title rather than like a sad, lonely, you know, I am legend kind of thing. You know?
And then in 2007, there was another adaptation starring Will Smith as Robert Neville. Now, I was 15 when that movie came out, and I was excited as hell because I had seen The Last Man on Earth and The Omega Man prior to that, and right before I saw the movie, I read the book, and I was really in love with the book at the time, and I knew the movie was going to be different from the book by seeing the trailers, but I don't know. When I saw the film, I was just so disappointed, and I don't know what it was, but there was just something that the book had, and even Last Man on Earth and Omega Man had, that I thought the Will Smith movie was lacking. I will say the positive, Will Smith did a great job in that movie. He was excellent in the film. But that was really, his performance was really the only really good thing about that film. First of all, the creatures in the movie. Now, the creatures, I don't know if they were really, if you would really call them vampires. They were more like mutants in the Will Smith I Am Legend movie, but they were all CGI, and they looked fake as shit. I will say, like, the CGI for, like, making New York City look like this apocalyptic wasteland, that was really well done. But, like, the CGI for the creatures, it looked like a fucking video game. But what do you think of the 2007 I Am Legend film?
I like it. I'm not crazy about it. I think it's a serviceable adaptation of it. It's nothing that I think is, like, iconic or, you know, like, particularly amazing. Obviously, Will was a good choice. You're definitely right about that. He's always been the kind of guy who could, like, you know, hold the whole movie himself. But I love that the dog plays a bigger role, and its death in this one is much more heartbreaking.
Yeah.
It really it hits you way harder in this one. The psychological aspect of it is amped up a little more because they do the whole thing where he's going through a whole town of mannequins.
Oh, yeah.
And he's got this whole delusion going where, like, they're all, like, his neighbors and they're all talking to him and stuff like that. And then they get into the whole thing where the mutants figure out that's what he does during the day, so they start moving them around and making it look like, you know, like they're trying to attack him and stuff like that.
That was something, to the movie's credit, I did like. My issue with the movie is really towards the final act where it's like they had a chance to adapt stuff from the book, but I feel like they completely missed the point of the book.
I think what it was they knew it all falls apart at the ending for me.
Yeah.
Because they wanted something that was commercial, and they knew that if they did the ending of the book, it was going to piss people off.
Yeah.
So they wanted him to go out like a hero, so that he ends up, you know, obviously the title has to mean something. So he is legend, but he's a legend in a very different way. Again, he's the savior of humanity in a way that was kind of less profound than it was in Omega Man.
Yeah.
But the big hole in it is there's really no reason for him to stay behind and blow himself up. He could just as easily just like throw it and get in the hole with them.
Yeah, and there was an alternate ending to the movie where he drives off with them, but that alternate ending was a huge plot hole because I've seen the alternate cut of the film and it ends where they're driving over a bridge, and it's like, wait a minute. The movie established before that all the bridges were destroyed leading into Manhattan, so where the fuck did that bridge come from?
Yeah, they were kind of throwing darts when it came to that like whole final like half hour.
Yeah. You see, what I thought the movie was going to go for, because I knew in the movie the creatures were more like mutants and vampires, I thought maybe it was going to be them as the villains in the beginning, and then what I thought would have been cool is have the second half have the villains be more like a cult of other survivors, like in the Omega Man.
That would have been awesome.
And that would have tied in more with the book, with how the book was, you had this new society of vampires, but instead in this movie it would be more of like a cult, like in the Omega. I thought that would have been cool, but I feel like they just missed that point entirely.
Yeah, I get that they're like trying to save money with the CG stuff, but they would have looked way cooler made up.
Oh yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
That would have been. I feel like that probably would have helped the movie in terms of quality. You would have been able to take it a little bit more seriously. But I mean, he really nails Robert Neville. You get the science aspect, you get the isolation aspect.
Well, I want to point something out too. In the book, Neville wasn't a scientist; he was a plant worker, and he sort of had to teach himself about viruses and bacteria in the book. But in all three film adaptations, they make him a scientist.
I think it makes sense because it's sort of film. The thing about film is you got to be very direct.
Yeah.
And to kind of explain that he was an everyman who had to figure that out for himself, as cool and as interesting as that is, in film, it's just easier to have to be, he was already a scientist. It just makes sense to do, in terms of like changing up stuff for, the purposes of film.
Yeah. There was technically a fourth film adaptation of this book in, I think, the same year as the Will Smith one, but it was a direct-to-DVD film, and it was made as sort of a cash-in on the Will Smith movie. It was called I Am Omega, and it was made by a company called The Asylum, which is famous or infamous, depending on your perspective on... It's famous for making these, like, really cheap rip-offs of mainstream movies. They're called mockbusters, and that's essentially what I Am Omega was. It was a mockbuster on the Will Smith I Am Legend movie. But I will say, to the film's credit, the creatures in the movie, they actually used real actors with makeup and suits, and ironically, they ended up looking better in that movie than in the Will Smith I Am Legend movie. And also, to the film's credit, it at least seemed like the makers of that movie were familiar with the source material. Like, it seemed like they actually read the book, and it was taking a lot of stuff from the Omega Man. Like, at a certain point in that movie, Richard, who is sort of the Robert Neville stand-in, does say a line that Charlton Heston said in the Omega Man. So, to the film's credit, it was taking stuff from the book and from the previous adaptations of the book. But besides that, yeah, it was a pretty shitty freaking movie. I was watching it the other night, and I lost interest about a half hour in. Like, about a half hour in, I just started going on my computer and doing other things, and I had the movie on as background noise. Like, it's pretty bad. If you want to count it as an adaptation of I Am Legend, it's easily the worst adaptation of the book. What do you think of I Am Omega?
Yeah, it's what you said. It's cheesy as hell. It's not even a B movie. Like, it's less than that.
Oh, it's a Z grade movie.
Exactly. Mark Damascus, like we said, like the strength of the previous three was that they had these great actors in the role who could hold their own. Mark, I like him, don't get me wrong, but it's just he does not have that presence,
Yeah.
It's okay, if you want to mess around and see like this weird sort of underground like adaptation of this story. Yeah, it's like a cool thing to check out, but on the whole, it's really nothing great. But the thing is, it's not meant to be anything great. It's meant to just be like a silly like cash grab. That's all they make. They're not expecting it to be anything amazing.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know who Asylum is, they're the same company that put out the Sharknado movies.
Sharknado, like Snakes on a Train, Atlantic Rim, like all these ridiculous like rip-off movies. So their catalog is like fun to go through if you want to see like all these ridiculous like rip-offs. But this you can tell there was actually a surprising amount of thought put into it because the line from it sort of compounds like all these adaptations into one concept.
Yeah.
But beyond that, it really does not have much going for it.
There is also a porno version of I Am Legend called I Am Virgin. The Simpsons did their own version of this story as one of the Treehouse of Horror episodes, the Omega Man. I doubt they're going to do this anytime soon, but I would love to see another adaptation of I Am Legend that actually follows the book. And I don't know if you could see this, but I could really see Tom Hardy as Robert Neville.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
Yeah,
for sure.
I doubt it's going to happen, because I think right now Warner Brothers owns the rights to the title I Am Legend, and I know for years they've been trying to do a sequel to the Will Smith movie. Mm-hmm. I doubt that's going to happen at this point, but I really would love to see, like, them, not even just them, but anybody do, like, a Another adaptation that really does focus on the themes of the novel and really focuses more on the psychological dread of being alone.
Netflix obviously is like kind of like the media behemoth right now, and they're doing some really good adaptations. They just did like a really good one of Haunting of Hill House that I'm really enjoying. So I could see them doing like maybe like a quick like 6-episode mini of this.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, then you stand the problem of like how much do you have to add and how much do you have to expand for what's supposed to be like an isolated, quick story.
True, but to be honest, I would like to see maybe a little bit more about the new vampire society that you see coming up. So maybe if they do that, maybe have the last 2 episodes focus more on them. Maybe have it told more from Ruth's perspective.
Yeah. 2 episodes focusing on Ruth, that would make sense.
Yeah.
And I mean, Haunting of Hill House, is a good example. I mean, that took like, what was, I think it was like a 180-page story, and it really, it brought like all this interesting complexity to it. So a big part of that actually was the fact that they hired Mike Flanagan, who was the guy who did Oculus and all these really good horror films. So I think it depends on who you would get to write and direct. That's kind of really where the whole thing like lives or dies. I'd like to see Netflix do it as like a miniseries or something like that. It would work really well. If they got Tom, that'd be great.
Yeah.
I'd watch it.
Now, as we point out already, some people consider Night of the Living Dead to be an unofficial adaptation of I Am Legend, and the influence is there, but at the same time, though, Romero still very much made it his own. But you could still see the influence in, I would say, the themes, too, because one of the main themes of Night of the Living Dead was this whole idea of a new society sort of supplanting an old society, which you very much see in I Am Legend. And even this whole idea of they're us, you kind of get that in I Am Legend, where arguably the main villain of I Am Legend is Ben Cortman, Robert Neville's old friend, and the point that Ben Cortman was Neville's friend is sort of like this idea that these are people we used to know and they're not who they are anymore. So you could see the influence in that regard, I would say. That would also include the sequels to Night of the Living Dead, like Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, Land of the Dead, and such, and stuff like the 1990 remake of Night of the Living Dead, and all the stuff that was inspired by Night of the Living Dead, like Lucio Fulci's Zombie, Return of the Living Dead, Resident Evil, The Walking Dead, both the comics and the TV show. Stuff like World War Z, all of that was influenced by Night of the Living Dead, but Night of the Living Dead was influenced by I Am Legend, so it's funny, like, you could call Night the father of the modern zombie genre, but this is almost like the grandfather of the modern zombie genre, in a way.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah. And you could also see the influence of this in something like 28 Days Later, which you brought up before. Now, I don't personally count 28 Days Later as a zombie film because they're not dead, but you could still see the I Am Legend influence in that movie.
Yeah, I really love that movie. It's all over it. It's basically like a British version of it, almost.
Yeah. And then even something like Stephen King's Cell, which was very much King's tribute to Romero, but once again, Romero was taken off of this book, so you could see the influence in Cell. Even something like The Stand, you could see the influence of I Am Legend on The Stand, and even The Mist and some of King's other post-apocalyptic stories, you could see the I Am Legend influence.
Yeah, there was a book in Nightmares and Dreamscapes, I think it was called. It's called The End of the Whole Mess.
Oh yeah,
that's got a lot of similarities too, about like like a pandemic and all that stuff. So it's ridiculous actually when you think about how much it's influenced. Yeah, I mean, how often do you see like post-apocalyptic stories?
Yeah, and I think almost any post-apocalyptic story you could think of probably owes something to this book.
Definitely.
Now, I do want to point out this was not the first post-apocalyptic story. I mean, Mary Shelley did a post-apocalyptic novel called The Last Man, which was probably an influence on this book in some way.
Yeah, and obviously she was brilliant, and she came up with such ingenious ideas for her time, and she was reinventing, she was inventing so many wheels there. So, I mean, to think it goes that far back, and that, even Richard was taking influence from something, and, everybody's just kind of, channeling the same ideas. It's really cool to see that kind of like bleed throughout all fiction.
Now, there were other vampire stories that were definitely influenced by this book. Like, you could see the influence of this book in something like 30 Days of Night by Steve Niles, because that also sort of deals with the concept of vampirism being a virus.
Yeah, I mean, you could see it throughout all Steve's work, by the way. I think this is one of his big influences.
Yeah, and Steve Niles also did a comic book adaptation of this book.
Yeah.
So you could definitely see the influence that this book had on him. Now, I don't know about the Blade comics, but I know the Blade movies definitely took some inspiration from this book. Like, the whole idea of vampires having their own civilization, that was sort of taken from this book, and even the Blade movies sort of deal with this concept that vampirism is actually a disease.
Right.
Even though those movies do incorporate some supernatural aspects to it, they also have sort of this biological aspect to it, too. There was a book called The Passage by Justin Cronin, which was very similar to this because it was a book about a plague that wipes out humanity, but it did also involve vampires as well. Like, basically the plague's victims became sort of like vampires, and then Guillermo del Toro's book, The Strain, was very much influenced by this book, because that was also a story about vampires taking over the earth. There's also a movie called Daybreakers, which definitely seems to have taken a lot of stuff from this book. I mean, this whole idea of vampires taking over the earth.
That's a really underrated movie. It's such a great. It's almost like sort of the same idea, just with a whole community within it. It's like, okay, they're the new world order, and kind of we're slowly being phased out. But rather than the way I Am Legend looks at it, it instead looks at it like, okay, in the new world, we're the pets.
Yeah.
You know, and they're our overseers. You know, they actually established a society that's pretty similar to what we had. Mm-hmm. It's just the idea of like, okay, now we're the marginalized ones. It's a very different look at it. Definitely check that out if you haven't seen it. It's a really underrated movie.
There's also a movie called Stakeland, which I'll admit I haven't seen yet. I have it, but Stakeland was also about sort of like vampires taking over. That definitely, I think, was probably influenced by this. So, the influence of I Am Legend is everywhere. Like, this book probably influenced a lot more than people realize, yet not too many people realize how much it influenced. You know what I mean? It's almost like the book isn't as famous as it should be, yet it's a book that influenced something that everybody has seen at least once, you know? Like,
yeah, it's symbiosis, you know? I feel like writers always revisit the same ideas, you know, both in their own work and, you know, in sort of referencing other people's work. So you see kind of these same concepts kind of go in circles over and over again, interpreted in different ways.
So that was our review on I Am Legend by Richard Matheson, and bye.